The oldest known cities are roughly 6,000 years old. The pyramids? Around 4,500. Writing showed up maybe 5,000 years back. But what if that's not the beginning? What if there was something older, something drowned beneath hundreds of feet of ocean when the Ice Age ended and the seas rose 400 feet in just a few thousand years? What if civilization didn't start when we think it did? Picture this. You're standing on a coastline 12,000 years ago, staring out at land that stretches miles beyond where the ocean sits today. Forests grow where coral reefs now thrive. Rivers carve valleys through what we call the continental shelf. And somewhere out there, maybe, just maybe, people built something we've never found. Let's rewind to when the world looked completely different. 20,000 years ago, Earth was deep in the grip of the last ice age. Glaciers covered massive portions of the northern hemisphere. Ice sheets stretched across Canada, Scandinavia, and northern Asia, some piles standing 2 miles thick. All that frozen water had to come from somewhere. It came from the oceans. Sea levels dropped dramatically. Estimates vary, but most researchers agree the oceans sat somewhere between 400 and 430 feet lower than they do now. That's not just a number. That's entire landscapes exposed. The English Channel didn't exist. Britain connected directly to mainland Europe through a landmass called Doggerland. Indonesia's islands formed a continuous shelf called Sunda. The Persian Gulf was a river valley. The Mediterranean coastline extended miles beyond its current borders. People lived in these places. We know this because we occasionally find evidence. Fishermen drag up Stone Age tools from the North Sea. Divers discover submerged cave paintings off the coast of France. Ancient campsites emerge from what's now underwater near Australia. The archaeological record isn't silent here, it's just drowned. But here's where it gets interesting. We assume these were simple hunter-gatherers, scattered bands without complex organization. That assumption rests on one massive problem. We barely looked. Less than 10% of the ocean floor has been mapped in detail. The continental shelves, where ancient coastlines would have been, remain largely unexplored. If something existed there, something more sophisticated than we expect, we wouldn't know. Think about where civilizations tend to develop. River valleys, coastal plains, fertile lowlands with access to water and trade routes. Exactly the kind of terrain that would have been prime real estate during the Ice Age. Exactly the kind of land now sitting under hundreds of feet of seawater. If you wanted to hide an ancient civilization from modern archaeologists, you couldn't pick a better spot. The end of the Ice Age wasn't gradual in the way we usually imagine. Yes, the overall warming took thousands of years, but within that long thaw came sudden catastrophic events. Massive glacial lakes held back by ice dams would burst free and dump unimaginable volumes of water into the oceans within days or weeks. These weren't minor floods. They were apocalyptic. One example stands out. Lake Agassiz sat in central North America, larger than all the Great Lakes combined. When its ice dam failed around 8,400 years ago, it released so much fresh water into the North Atlantic that it temporarily disrupted ocean currents and triggered a cold snap lasting centuries. That's one lake. There were dozens of these ticking time bombs scattered across the northern continents. Now, imagine you're living on a coastal plain during this period. Your community has been there for generations. You've built structures, maybe even permanent ones. You've established trade networks with neighboring groups. You understand astronomy enough to track seasons. Then the water comes, not slowly, not with warning. A wall of water traveling faster than anyone can run. Everything you built vanishes beneath the surge. The survivors scatter inland, traumatized, their history erased. This isn't speculation about whether floods happened. They absolutely did. The question is whether anyone was there to experience them at a level of sophistication we haven't discovered yet. Let's talk about Göbekli Tepe for a moment. This archaeological site in Turkey completely rewrote our understanding of early civilization when it was properly excavated in the 1990s. Massive stone pillars arranged in circles, decorated with intricate carvings of animals. The site dates to around 9,500 BCE. That's 11,500 years ago. It predates pottery. It predates agriculture. It predates everything we thought had to come first. The standard narrative said you needed farming before you could have monumental architecture. You needed settled communities supported by agriculture before you could organize the labor for big construction projects. Göbekli Tepe proved that wrong. Hunter-gatherers built it. Complex hunter-gatherers, sure, but people without farms or cities as we define them. If that level of organization existed 11,500 years ago in the mountains of Turkey, what existed on the fertile coastal plains that are now underwater? We found Göbekli Tepe because it was built on a hill that stayed dry. Anything built at lower elevations during the same period would be submerged now. The Persian Gulf offers a compelling case study. Today, it's a shallow sea, averaging about 160 feet deep. During the Ice Age, it was a river valley. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers would have flowed through a broad, fertile basin before reaching the ocean much farther south. This valley would have been prime real estate. Fresh water, rich soil, access to both river and coastal resources. Some researchers have proposed this area as a candidate for early civilization precisely because of its advantageous geography during the right time period. The flooding of this valley happened relatively recently in geological terms, mostly between 12,000 and 8,000 years ago. If communities existed there, they would have watched their world disappear beneath rising water. Interestingly, some of the oldest flood myths come from this region. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's earliest written stories, describes a catastrophic flood that destroys the world. Similar stories appear across Mesopotamian cultures. Standard interpretation says these myths emerged from local river flooding, which certainly happened. But what if there's a deeper memory embedded in these stories? What if they preserve some echo of the actual inundation of the Persian Gulf Basin? Before you dismiss this as wild speculation, consider how oral traditions work. Indigenous Australian cultures have oral histories describing coastlines that existed when sea levels were lower, details that match what geological evidence shows. These stories persisted for potentially 10,000 years or more. Human memory, when culturally reinforced, can preserve information across dozens of generations. The problem with finding evidence isn't just that it's underwater. It's that sediment buries things quickly in marine environments. Anything on the ancient seafloor would now sit beneath layers of silt, sand, and biological material accumulated over millennia. You can't just look at the bottom with sonar and expect to see ruins. You'd need to dig systematically across vast areas. The cost would be astronomical. Yet we've found hints. Divers have discovered what appear to be man-made structures off the coast of India near Gujarat. Stone formations that some argue show evidence of planning and construction. The site remains controversial, with mainstream archaeologists skeptical of claims about its artificial nature. But even the skeptics admit we need more investigation. Off the coast of Japan near Yonaguni Island lies another controversial site. Massive stone formations that look suspiciously like stepped pyramids or terraced platforms. Discovered in 1987 by a dive tour operator, the Yonaguni Monument has sparked fierce debate. Is it natural geology that happens to look artificial? Or is it a genuine archaeological site from when this area was above water? The formations show what appear to be right angles, flat surfaces, and carved channels. Some researchers see clear evidence of human modification. Others argue that geological processes, particularly the way certain rock types fracture and erode, can create similar features naturally. Both sides make valid points. The truth is, without more evidence, we can't be certain. What makes Yonaguni particularly interesting is its age. If it is artificial, it would have been built before the area flooded, which means at least 10,000 years ago, possibly older. That pushes it back to a time when conventional history says no one in that region had the capability for such construction. That's exactly why mainstream archaeology resists the interpretation. It doesn't fit the timeline. But timelines change when new evidence emerges. Göbekli Tepe changed the timeline. So did discoveries in the Americas that pushed back the date of human arrival by thousands of years. Every decade brings findings that force us to revise our assumptions. The question isn't whether our current understanding is incomplete. It's how incomplete it actually is. Let's consider the technical challenges of building something that could last 10,000 years. Stone works. The pyramids prove that. But most structures don't survive millennia even on dry land. Wood rots, mud bricks dissolve, even stone buildings crumble if they're not maintained. Now add the destructive power of the ocean. Waves, currents, chemical erosion, biological activity. The marine environment is incredibly hostile to preservation. If an Ice Age civilization existed at the level of, say, ancient Sumer, most evidence would vanish completely. Mud brick buildings, gone. Wooden structures, gone. Pottery and everyday objects, scattered and destroyed. Only the most robust stone constructions would have any chance of surviving in recognizable form. And even those would be buried under sediment, covered in coral, broken by tectonic activity. This is why the absence of evidence isn't as meaningful as it might seem. We're looking for something that would be incredibly hard to find even if it existed. The default assumption that we haven't found it, therefore it didn't exist, only works if we've actually looked thoroughly. We haven't. Modern technology is starting to change this. Multi-beam sonar can map the seafloor in remarkable detail. Autonomous underwater vehicles can survey large areas efficiently. Remote sensing techniques keep improving, but these tools are expensive, and deep water archaeology isn't a funding priority. Most underwater exploration focuses on known shipwrecks or oil and gas development, not searching for hypothetical ancient sites. There's also a philosophical resistance in archaeology. The field has been burned before by wild claims and pseudo-scientific theories. Atlantis, ancient aliens, lost super civilizations with magical technology. These ideas have poisoned the well, making serious researchers hesitant to investigate anything that sounds remotely similar. The result is a discipline that sometimes becomes too conservative, dismissing possibilities before properly investigating them. This isn't about proving ancient super civilizations existed. It's about acknowledging that our current picture of prehistory has massive gaps. And some of those gaps are literally underwater. The people living on those Ice Age coastlines were anatomically modern humans, just as intelligent as us. They had tens of thousands of years to develop complex cultures. Writing off that entire period as primitive based on incomplete evidence seems premature. Consider what we do know about Upper Paleolithic humans, the people living during the Ice Age. They created sophisticated cave art with paintings in places like Lascaux and Altamira, showing remarkable skill and symbolic thinking. They carved intricate figurines, including the famous Venus figures found across Europe. They crafted complex tools, including specialized implements for specific tasks. They buried their dead with ceremony, suggesting developed belief systems. They also traveled. Obsidian, a volcanic glass prized for making sharp tools, has been found hundreds of miles from its source, indicating trade networks spanning vast distances. Shells from the Mediterranean appear in Ice Age sites far inland. These people were connected, communicating across regions, sharing ideas and materials. If they could do all that, why couldn't some groups develop further? Not everywhere, maybe, not all at once, but somewhere, in some particularly favorable location, couldn't a group have stumbled onto early agriculture or proto-urbanism or monumental construction? And if they did it on land that's now 300 feet underwater, how would we know? The Younger Dryas period offers another intriguing piece of this puzzle. About 12,800 years ago, Earth experienced a sudden return to Ice Age conditions. Temperatures dropped dramatically. Glaciers that had been retreating started advancing again. This cold snap lasted roughly 1,200 years before warming resumed. The cause remains debated, though most scientists point to disruption of ocean currents from glacial meltwater. Some researchers have proposed a more dramatic trigger. They argue that a comet or asteroid impact, or more likely a series of impacts from a fragmenting object, struck Earth around this time. Evidence includes a layer of platinum-rich sediment dated to the start of the Younger Dryas. Microscopic diamonds formed by extreme pressure and widespread signs of massive wildfires. This hypothesis remains controversial, with ongoing debate about whether the evidence truly indicates impacts or has other explanations. But here's what's undeniable. Something happened 12,800 years ago that caused rapid climate change. And that change would have been devastating for any coastal communities because it triggered another round of sea level rise as glaciers eventually melted again. If sophisticated societies existed along Ice Age coastlines, the Younger Dryas period would have been catastrophic for them. First the climate chaos, then the flooding as temperatures finally warmed for good. Imagine the cascade of disasters. Sudden cooling kills crops and game. Communities that had grown comfortable face starvation. Social structures break down. Knowledge gets lost as populations crash. Then, after centuries of struggle, the warming returns, and with it comes the water. The final blow. Everything remaining gets swallowed by the sea. The survivors would scatter inland, bringing fragments of their former culture, stories of lost homelands, myths of floods and fallen worlds. Technical knowledge degraded, but not completely forgotten. Perhaps some of what we see as the sudden emergence of civilization in places like Mesopotamia and Egypt wasn't entirely from scratch. Perhaps it was, in part, a rebuilding. This connects to something called the Silurian hypothesis, though not quite in the way that term is usually used. The concept asks whether we could detect an industrial civilization that existed millions of years ago in Earth's geological record. Most of its traces would have vanished. But the question applies at smaller timescales too. Could we detect a Stone Age civilization from 10,000 years ago if most of its footprint was underwater? The answer is uncomfortably uncertain. We probably could, if we looked in the right places with the right tools. But we mostly haven't looked. The continental shelves remain archaeological dark zones. We've explored more of Mars's surface than we have of our own prehistoric coastlines. There's a deeper question here about the nature of civilization itself. We tend to define it narrowly: writing, cities, centralized government, monumental architecture. But those are just the forms civilization took in the Bronze Age onwards. Could there be other forms? Could you have sophisticated, complex societies without all those markers? Göbekli Tepe suggests yes. So does the fact that hunter-gatherer societies in the Pacific Northwest developed complex hierarchies, art traditions, and permanent villages without agriculture. Maybe we're looking for the wrong things. Maybe an Ice Age civilization wouldn't resemble Sumer or Egypt at all. Maybe it would look more like a network of trading communities with specialized knowledge about astronomy, navigation, and resource management, but without writing or massive stone monuments. That kind of society would leave almost no archaeological trace, especially if most of its range is now submerged. The question isn't whether Atlantis was real. That's not what this is about. It's about whether we've correctly understood the full scope of human prehistory, or whether there are chapters we've missed because they're hidden in places we haven't seriously investigated. The more we learn about how capable Upper Paleolithic people were, the more reasonable it seems that some groups might have pushed further than we've given them credit for. And that brings us to the flood myths. They're everywhere, not just in the Middle East, but across the world. Native American traditions describe great floods. So do stories from India, China, Southeast Asia, Australia, and Polynesia. The standard explanation says these myths arise independently because flooding is a common natural disaster that affects societies everywhere. That's probably true for many of them, but some of these stories contain details that seem oddly specific. Dimensions of boats, descriptions of the water rising to cover mountains, accounts of worlds being destroyed and only a few survivors remaining. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes the flood hero being warned by a god to build a boat and save breeding pairs of animals. Sound familiar? That story predates the biblical flood narrative by more than 1,000 years. Could these myths preserve actual memories of post-Ice Age flooding? Some researchers think it's possible. Indigenous Australian stories describe the flooding of specific locations that we can verify happened based on geological evidence. Those events occurred 7,000 to 10,000 years ago. The stories survived. Why couldn't similar memories survive elsewhere, passed down, and eventually written into the first literatures of ancient civilizations? This doesn't mean the myths are historically accurate in their details. Oral traditions change over time, gaining embellishments, merging with other stories, taking on religious significance, but there might be a kernel of real events at their core, events that seemed apocalyptic to the people who experienced them. The drowning of entire known worlds beneath rising seas. What would it mean if we found proof, not vague structures of debated origin, but clear evidence of a sophisticated society from before the Holocene epoch began? It would fundamentally reshape how we understand human history. It would prove that the path to civilization isn't as linear as we've assumed. That development can happen, be wiped out, and have to start over. That we've been through cycles before. It would also be humbling. We like to think of ourselves as the culmination of progress, the peak of human achievement. Finding out that people 12,000 years ago might have reached surprising levels of sophistication, only to have it all destroyed by climate and catastrophe, would remind us how fragile our own civilization might be. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The evidence we have now is suggestive, not conclusive. Underwater sites that might be artificial, flood myths that might preserve real memories, a time period with the right conditions for development and the wrong conditions for preservation. None of that proves anything existed. It just suggests we haven't finished looking. The continental shelf off southern India stretches for miles beyond the current coastline. During the Ice Age, this area would have been a broad plain, watered by rivers that now empty directly into the sea. It's exactly the kind of environment where you'd expect people to thrive. And there are geological indications that this region didn't flood gradually. Some areas may have experienced rapid inundation from meltwater pulses. If communities existed there, they would have had little time to escape. Everything they built would now sit under 100 to 300 feet of water, buried under millennia of sediment. Finding evidence would require systematic surveys, drilling, excavation, the kind of effort that would cost millions and take years. For a hypothesis that most archaeologists consider unlikely at best. That's the crux of the problem. In science, you need funding to investigate. You get funding by convincing people your hypothesis is worth testing. But if the mainstream considers your hypothesis fringe, getting that funding becomes nearly impossible. It's a catch 22. We can't find evidence without looking, but we can't justify looking without preliminary evidence. Yet occasionally, accidents happen. Fishermen snag something unusual. A storm shifts sand and exposes something unexpected. A developer planning a coastal project requires an archaeological survey. These random discoveries have given us hints that something might be out there. They just haven't given us enough to build a compelling case. The truth is, we might never know for certain. The ocean is vast, sediment is thick, and time has erased most traces. Even if sophisticated societies existed on Ice Age coastlines, recovering proof might be beyond our current capabilities. Or maybe someone will get lucky. Maybe a team will find something unmistakable that forces the entire field to reconsider. Archaeology has been revolutionized by single discoveries before. Until then, we're left with questions and possibilities, with the knowledge that our ancestors were capable and intelligent, living in a world we've barely explored, with flood myths that might mean more than we've acknowledged, and with hundreds of miles of ancient coastline sitting beneath the waves, holding whatever secrets they hold. The Ice Age ended. The seas rose. Entire landscapes vanished beneath water that had been locked in ice for tens of thousands of years. If anyone lived there, if anyone built there, their story drowned with them. Maybe it's time we seriously consider diving in to find out. The question becomes, what would we even look for? When you're searching the ocean floor for evidence of Ice Age civilization, you can't exactly expect to find intact buildings or pristine artifacts. After 12,000 years underwater, covered in sediment, battered by currents, most materials would have degraded beyond recognition. Wood? Gone. Fabric? Long dissolved. Even stone structures would be eroded, fractured, potentially scattered across the seafloor by geological forces we barely understand. But there are signatures, patterns that don't occur naturally. Geologists can identify worked stone versus natural stone. They can distinguish artificial alignments from random geological formations. The trick is getting down there to look in the first place, and knowing where to look in an area covering hundreds of thousands of square miles. Some researchers have suggested starting with predictive modeling. You take what we know about Ice Age geography, climate data, river systems that existed back then, and you identify the areas most likely to have supported human settlement. Then you focus your search on those zones. It's similar to how archaeologists on land survey promising areas before committing to full excavation. Except underwater, even the survey is exponentially more difficult and expensive. There have been a handful of attempts. In 2002, marine archaeologists surveyed the Gulf of Cambay off the coast of Gujarat in India. Sonar imaging revealed what some interpreted as geometric patterns on the seafloor. Structures that looked rectilinear, organized, possibly artificial. They recovered some artifacts, including what they claimed was worked wood dated to about 9,500 years ago. The findings were controversial. Critics argued the formations were natural, the result of geological processes rather than human construction. The wood dating was questioned. The entire project became mired in dispute and eventually faded from mainstream attention. But here's what's interesting. Even the critics didn't claim the formations were definitely natural. They said the evidence wasn't strong enough to prove they were artificial, which is different. It means we're operating in a zone of uncertainty where neither side can definitively prove their case without more data. And getting more data requires resources nobody seems willing to commit. Similar patterns have emerged elsewhere. Off the coast of Japan, there's the Yonaguni Monument, a massive rock formation that some argue shows clear signs of human modification. Terraces, right angles, apparent tool marks. Others insist it's entirely geological, a product of natural erosion and fracturing in sedimentary rock. The debate has raged for decades without resolution because the evidence is ambiguous. You can look at the same formation and see what you expect to see based on your prior assumptions. That's the fundamental problem with underwater archaeology in this context. The evidence has to be absolutely overwhelming to overcome skepticism. A single carved stone could be dismissed as anomalous. Even multiple artifacts can be explained away as items that washed out to sea from known coastal settlements. You'd need something undeniable. A complex structure, clear tool marks, multiple artifacts in context, ideally with organic material that could be dated. The bar is incredibly high, and maybe that's appropriate. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, as the saying goes, but it also means we might be systematically biasing ourselves against discovery. If we only look where we're confident we'll find something, and we're not confident about Ice Age coastal sites, then we'll never look seriously. And if we never look seriously, we'll never find anything, even if it's there. There's another angle to consider. What if these societies weren't what we typically imagine when we think of ancient civilization? We tend to picture cities, monumental architecture, writing systems, complex hierarchies. But sophisticated doesn't necessarily mean urban. A society could have advanced knowledge, complex social structures, impressive technology for their time, without building anything that would survive 12,000 years underwater. Think about it. If you dropped into a modern hunter-gatherer society that had been refining their techniques for thousands of years, you'd find incredible sophistication, detailed ecological knowledge, complex social rules, advanced tool-making, astronomical observations, oral traditions containing massive amounts of information, none of which would leave obvious archaeological traces, especially underwater. The bias in archaeology has always been toward civilizations that built in stone, that created durable artifacts, that left clear marks on the landscape. But that's not the only path to cultural complexity. Maybe the people living on Ice Age coastlines were maritime specialists, groups who'd spent thousands of years perfecting boat building, navigation, fishing techniques, understanding of ocean currents and seasonal patterns. They might have had seasonal camps rather than permanent settlements, moving with resources, building with materials that wouldn't survive. Their achievements might have been intellectual and cultural rather than architectural. And those are exactly the things that would vanish beneath the waves without a trace. Except for one thing: stories. Oral traditions can preserve information across thousands of years, especially if they're important to survival or identity. And that brings us back to flood myths. Because if we take those seriously, not as literal history, but as cultural memory shaped into narrative, they might be telling us something real happened. something traumatic enough to embed itself in collective memory across multiple cultures. The flood myths don't just describe water rising. They often include specific details: the speed of the inundation, the loss of land, sometimes even geographic markers that, if you squint, might correspond to real locations. The Aboriginal Australian stories are particularly striking because they include details about specific bays and headlands that are now underwater, places that would have been above sea level during the Ice Age. That's not proof of anything, but it's suggestive. It implies a continuity of oral tradition spanning more than 10,000 years. And it's not just coastal flooding. Some myths describe a time before the flood when things were different, when the world was larger, when certain lands existed that are now gone, when the stars were in different positions, which actually makes sense given axial precession over thousands of years. These details might be coincidental, or they might be fragments of actual memory distorted and mythologized, but rooted in real events. The scientific establishment has historically been dismissive of this line of thinking, and for understandable reasons. Mythology is not data. Stories change with each telling. Cultural narratives are shaped by present concerns as much as past events. You can't build a rigorous case on folklore, but maybe we've been too quick to dismiss it entirely. Maybe the right approach is to use myths as potential guides, suggesting where to look while demanding hard evidence before drawing conclusions. There's precedent for this. The city of Troy was considered mythological until Schliemann excavated it. Aboriginal Australian stories about volcanic eruptions were dismissed as fantasy until geologists confirmed eruptions occurred at those locations within the timeline of human habitation. Oral traditions about tsunamis in the Pacific Northwest seemed like exaggeration until geological evidence confirmed massive earthquakes and waves. Sometimes the stories point toward real events. The challenge is separating signal from noise, figuring out which elements of a myth might be based in reality and which are pure invention or symbolic. That requires careful analysis, cross-cultural comparison, and most importantly, verification through physical evidence. The stories alone don't prove anything, but they might tell us where to dig, or in this case, where to dive. Let's assume for a moment that something was there, that communities existed on Ice Age coastlines and were destroyed by rising seas. What would that mean for our understanding of human history? Honestly, it wouldn't overturn everything we think we know. It would fill in gaps. We already know humans were behaviorally modern by this point. We know they were capable of impressive achievements. Finding evidence of coastal settlements wouldn't require rewriting human evolution or proposing lost super civilizations with technology beyond our current understanding. It would, however, change the narrative. Right now, the story of civilization begins with agriculture in the Fertile Crescent around 10,000 BCE. That's when we see the first permanent settlements, the first villages growing into towns, the first signs of what we'd recognize as civilization. But if there were sophisticated societies before that, developing along different trajectories, then civilization doesn't have a single origin point. It emerges multiple times, in multiple places, through multiple paths, some of which dead-ended when their environments were destroyed. That's a more complex story. It suggests human cultural development isn't a straight line from simple to complex, but a messier process with branches that went nowhere, experiments that failed, knowledge that was lost. It makes our own civilization seem less inevitable and more contingent, less the result of linear progress and more the product of particular circumstances that happen to persist long enough for us to build on them. It would also raise uncomfortable questions about what else we might have lost. If rising seas destroyed evidence of coastal societies once, what other catastrophic events might have erased evidence of human achievement? What was lost in other climate shifts, other natural disasters, other moments when the environment changed faster than people could adapt? How many times have humans built something impressive only to have it erased by forces beyond their control? These aren't just academic questions. They're relevant to our current moment. We're living through rapid environmental change. Sea levels are rising again, though for different reasons than the end of the Ice Age. Coastal cities, where huge percentages of humanity currently live, are increasingly vulnerable. If it happened before, if entire populated coastlines were inundated and forgotten, that's not just ancient history. It's a warning. But we still don't have proof. We have suggestive anomalies, intriguing myths, and vast unexplored areas where evidence might exist. What we don't have is the smoking gun, the unmistakable artifact or structure that would force the mainstream to take this seriously. And without that, the hypothesis remains speculative. Interesting to think about, but not established fact. Some researchers continue pushing forward despite the skepticism. They're using increasingly sophisticated technology, multi-beam sonar that can map the seafloor in extraordinary detail, submersibles that can investigate specific sites, remote sensing techniques that can penetrate sediment to reveal what lies beneath. The tools are getting better. The question is whether anyone will commit the resources to use them systematically in the right locations. There's also the problem of expertise. Underwater archaeology is its own specialized field. Most archaeologists work on land. The skills, methods, and equipment required for underwater work are different. You need people who understand both archaeology and marine environments. That's a small pool of experts, and most are focused on shipwrecks or known ancient ports, not speculative Ice Age sites. Convincing someone with those skills to dedicate years to searching for something that might not exist is a tough sell. Yet the possibility nags. The continental shelves are there, hundreds of thousands of square miles of former land now underwater. The Ice Age coastlines existed. People lived in coastal areas. The seas rose rapidly in some regions. All of that is established. The only question is whether anything significant existed in those areas and whether any trace remains. And we won't answer that question by ignoring it. Maybe the real issue is how we frame the search. If we're looking for lost Atlantis, for ancient advanced civilizations with mysterious technology, we're setting ourselves up for disappointment and ridicule. But if we're looking for evidence of Ice Age human adaptation to coastal environments, for signs of how our ancestors lived during a period we barely explored, that's legitimate archaeology. It's asking reasonable questions about a time and place where evidence is simply hard to find, not because it didn't exist, but because it's underwater. Reframing it that way might make funding easier to obtain. It might attract serious researchers rather than fringe theorists. It might allow for careful, methodical investigation without the baggage of sensationalized claims. Because, ultimately, whatever the truth is, it deserves to be investigated properly, with rigor, with skepticism, but also with genuine curiosity. The ocean holds secrets. That's not mysticism, that's simple fact. We've explored more of the moon's surface than the ocean floor. Vast areas remain unmapped, uninvestigated, unknown. And some of those areas were dry land during the Ice Age, land where humans could have lived, built, and thrived. What happened to them when the waters came is lost to time unless we make the effort to look. Maybe we'll find nothing. Maybe the harsh conditions of the Ice Age kept populations small and scattered, their material culture too minimal to survive underwater. Maybe the floods happened slowly enough that people simply migrated inland, taking everything portable with them, leaving no trace behind. That's possible, but the only way to know is to look. And if do find something, if evidence emerges of sophisticated Ice Age coastal societies, it won't make ancient aliens suddenly real or validate every fringe theory ever proposed. It'll simply mean humans were doing interesting things in places we haven't adequately investigated. It'll mean our history is richer and more complex than we currently believe. That's worth knowing. The flood myths might be cultural memory, or they might be coincidence. The underwater formations might be artificial, or they might be natural. The timeline might allow for significant development, or it might not. We're dealing with uncertainties, with possibilities rather than certainties. But that's where all discovery begins, with questions we don't yet know how to answer. The Ice Age coastlines are gone, swallowed by seas that rose when the ice melted. Whatever existed there, whoever lived there, their world ended in water. We can choose to shrug and assume nothing important was lost, or we can take seriously the possibility that we're missing part of our own story, that beneath the waves, buried under sediment, lie answers to questions we haven't fully articulated yet. The technology exists to search. The locations are identifiable. The only thing missing is commitment. The willingness to invest resources in what might seem like a long shot. But archaeology is full of long shots that paid off. Sometimes you have to dig where it seems unlikely just to be sure. And in this case, the digging happens to be underwater, in places nobody seriously looked, during a time period that remains poorly understood. We talk about human history as if we know it, as if the past is settled, documented, understood. But there are gaps. Long stretches where we know humans existed but have little idea what they were doing. The end of the Ice Age is one of those gaps, a period of massive environmental change, of human populations adapting to new conditions, of old worlds ending and new ones beginning. What happened during that transition might be more significant than we've realized. The seas rose, the coastlines drowned, and with them possibly went evidence of who we were before civilization as we know it began. Finding that evidence won't be easy. It might not even be possible. But the question remains, waiting beneath the waves, in the dark and the sediment and the deep, waiting for someone curious enough, determined enough, to finally go looking. Looking back at everything we've covered, one thing becomes clear. We're standing at the edge of our own understanding, staring out at questions we haven't fully committed to answering. The evidence suggests possibilities. Underwater formations that might be artificial. Flood myths carrying fragments of real memory. Ice Age coastlines that offered everything humans needed to thrive, now buried beneath hundreds of feet of ocean and millennia of sediment. None of it proves a lost civilization existed, but it proves we haven't looked hard enough to say it didn't. And maybe that's the real story here, not what was lost, but what we've chosen not to find. The ocean keeps its secrets. The question is whether we're ready to dive deeper.